Hello and welcome to the first of your guys' online Vietnam lectures. In this lecture, we're going to talk about a couple of things. First, we're going to start with a quick overview on colonialism and its effect on the development of Vietnam's Civil War. And then after that, we're going to look at how and why the U.S. involvement escalated between the Eisenhower, Kennedy, and then ultimately the Johnson administrations. As we discuss this early U.S. involvement in Vietnam, there's a couple of concept questions that I want you guys to keep in mind as we go through the lecture. The first one is how and why did U.S. involvement in Vietnam escalate? And then the second one is once we get to President Johnson, in what larger context did President Johnson view the conflict in Vietnam, and why was he so determined to support South Vietnam? A couple things to keep in mind is very much remember that the United States is entrenched in the Cold War during this time, and a quick reminder that the Cold War, it started in 1947, right after World War II, and it doesn't end until 1991, so way after Vietnam's going to end when the Soviet Union's going to finally break up. In this time, the United States is entrenched in our foreign policy of containment. Remember the idea that we're going to keep communism contained to where it already exists and not let it spread to other parts of the world. And in holding true to that foreign policy, this is going to be one of our hotter spots of the Cold War and one that is going to lead to a lot of U.S. deaths. If anyone's ever been to Washington, D.C., you may have gone and seen the Vietnam War Memorial. And the Vietnam War Memorial is a very powerful memorial. It was dedicated back in 1982. And one of the reasons that makes it so powerful is it's inscribed with all of the 58,000 names of the soldiers who either died or were declared missing in action as part of the war and never ever returned home. And this is kind of a rare look at the Vietnam War Memorial because usually you would see something that looks more like this. And here you can kind of see in this artist's depiction at the base of the wall flags and other items that were left by loved ones. And that's usually kind of like what you would see at the Vietnam War Memorial. You can also see in this artist's depiction that this is supposed to be a vet that's returning to the wall. And you can definitely see that he is feeling sorrow in this. And that's because Vietnam is definitely a very painful war. It's the second longest war in American history, and it lasted from the late 1950s, about 1959 with U.S. troop involvement, and it doesn't end with the United States troops until we actually pull out in 1973. And it's also something that changes Americans' attitudes regarding war, and it does so because of the fact that World War II and the other wars that preceded it, for the most part, were pretty popular in the United States, and a lot of Americans did feel that it was our duty to be there, and this isn't going to be the case in Vietnam. And you will kind of see that there's going to be a very heavy public split in terms of our support for Vietnam and this war. And you will also kind of see that this is also a war that's going to involve a lot of U.S. troops. 58,000 of them will die. It's going to involve a lot of U.S. military resources, but it's also a war where Congress actually technically didn't declare war. And realistically, Congress still hasn't declared war formally on another country since we were involved in World War II. And that's still true today in 2019 as I record this. In starting to talk about why the U.S. participated in this war and how we got involved, this is very much because of our policy, our Cold War policy, and our foreign policy of containment. And this is the idea that communism had sprouted up in North Vietnam just as kind of it had sprouted up in North Korea. And the United States is going to do the same thing that we did in Korea. We're going to go and help the South, in this case, South Vietnam, stop against what we see as a communist aggressor and try to prevent communism from spreading from North Vietnam into South Vietnam. Remember that just like in Korea, one of the big difference between our foreign policy of containment is in Europe, this was usually more of a financial matter. And in Asia, oftentimes like this, it does involve military resources and military troops. A lot of the protesters and the dissenters that you're going to see that are going to sprout up during this war will oftentimes kind of point the fact that they see this as kind of U.S. imperialism in a way. And they see this as the United States interjecting itself and getting involved in another country's foreign civil war and basically kind of setting up in lots of ways a puppet government, a government that is all about supposed democracy, but really is just kind of under the control of the United States. In terms of the costs of this war and the things that do go over, I did mention already that 58,000 American soldiers are going to die, but you also got to think about what this is going to mean on a global level. And you will also see the fact that there's going to be 3 million Vietnamese soldiers as well as a lot of civilians that are going to be casualties of this war as well. And so it is going to have a massive global impact. One of the other things that you do also see with this war, and it's kind of a contrast in comparison to our previous wars, is the media coverage oftentimes does show a lot of the brutality of this war. And there are going to be a lot of images that I will show you as we progress through this chapter and go through this unit. And a lot of the things that I'm going to show you, I'm showing you because of the fact that they do show the brutality of this war. They also do show you a whole lot of the hardships that our soldiers on both the Vietnamese sides as well as the United States side had to face in this war as part of it. In terms of like casualty rates and where this falls into the United States, you can see that Vietnam falls fourth in our list of wars in terms of U.S. casualties and in terms of our soldiers. And you can definitely see that for a war that's going to be way longer than World War II, which was only 4 years long and we lost 400,000 troops. This is definitely an improvement in the type of warfare that we're fighting, but it's also going to be a warfare that's going to involve a whole lot of brutality in lots of ways. And you will see that our U.S. soldiers are going to act pretty immorally sometimes. And in ways that they probably shouldn't as kind of part of that. In terms of looking at this on the global level, again, you can see like here that the Vietnam War, which does last in this time period that you can kind of see here, they're starting it at 64 to 75 because that's when you see most of the conflicts, and we'll talk about that here later. But you can see that while they do kind of explain here that 58,000 Americans do die, if you look at the North Vietnamese troops at 1.1 million deaths, and then the South Vietnamese troops at an estimated 200 to 250,000 deaths, that's a lot. But then also look at Vietnamese civilians. 2 million Vietnamese civilians are there. Now, these figures, especially on the Vietnamese side, are very much ballparks in lots of ways and their estimates. And one of the reasons is because of the fact that they didn't keep accurate counts of lots of the death rates, and plus a lot of times in terms of like the Viet Cong in the fights in the jungles and things like that, some of the death counts and death rates, they don't know if they're how accurately they were reported. I do believe that these figures that I'm showing you guys are some of the more accurate ones because they are coming from the sources for the U.S. troops from the National Archives and then for the Vietnamese troops from Encyclopedia Britannica. So next thing we're going to kind of do very, very quickly is we're going to look just as a quick reminder of imperialism and its effect it had on this area of the world. And previously, before the conflict in Vietnam, this peninsula in Asia was known as what was called Indochina, and it used to be under the control of the French. And that was true all the way until 1941. And that was true in 1941 because Ho Chi Minh is going to go and he's going to launch an independence movement, and he's going to establish in 1901 the Vietnam Independence League. And one of the reasons that he's able to do this and kind of end this period of French rule, or at least start to challenge French rule, is because of the fact that France at this time had been invaded by Nazi Germany. When they had basically lost control of their home country, it's really hard to hold your colonies, and it does kind of embolden Ho to go on his fight to go and try to go and create independent Vietnam. In doing this, he wants to go and launch a communist government, and he's very much hoping that the United States is going to support his fight against France, because he's hoping that we're going to see the parallels in this, and he's hoping that we're going to kind of see this as similar to our fight against the British in terms of wanting independence and overthrowing their colonial rule. In terms of the United States, we never ever buy into the parallels as kind of part of this. Ho Chi Minh does grow in popularity as the kind of time goes on. And by 1945, he does want to very much go and challenge French rule. And it does kind of happen in the fact that by 1946, you do have a fighting that breaks out between his communist movement that started in the north and French resistance in the south as kind of part of this. As a quick reminder of like where the United States is at this time, remember that following World War II, and even looking back to while we were in World War II, if we remember when FDR was still alive, FDR very much supported colonies becoming independent. And he did want to see colonialism and imperialism end throughout the world because he kind of thought that it only led to future conflicts and more war. After his death, when Truman takes over, Truman very much is more concerned with stopping the spread of communism. And a lot of that comes with the fact of Truman lost a lot of popularity in the United States when China fell to communism in 1949. And then again, you had North Korea fall to communism in 1950. And so Truman is kind of obsessed and very much wants to kind of stop that spread of communism, where FDR would have very much kind of probably supported independent movements, maybe even one like Ho Chi Minh's communist rule, because he would have probably probably not seen it really much as his problem in lots of ways. In terms of the French are defeated in 1954, and it is a pretty long fight that does happen. And even before actual peace is signed in 1954, by 1950, the French had lost 50,000 lives in their fight against the Vietnamese, and they had spent billions of dollars in this shortened war against the North Vietnamese. And the United States really should have learned their lesson as part of this. We should have seen the resolve of the North Vietnamese, their commitment to their want for independence, and their resources that they were willing to kind of like sacrifice and pay for with ultimately their lives as part of this. And we probably shouldn't have gotten involved in this conflict in any kind of way, shape, or form. Peace, in terms of like ending the French rule in Vietnam, is established at the Geneva Accords. And basically what was agreed upon at the Geneva Accords is that Vietnam was going to be divided into two different areas. And there was going to be a communism that was going to be allowed to exist in the north, and democracy was supposed to take root in the south. And the idea was that in 2 years, a national election was supposed to take place. That national election was then supposed to decide how to unify the country, either under a government of democracy or under a government of communism. But that election never really happened, and you do have fighting that continues between the North and the South at that time. Now that we kind of looked back at how the conflict in Vietnam was kind of started, we're going to look at how and why U.S. troop involvement escalated. And under the Eisenhower years is when you actually start and get the beginning of U.S. troop involvement. And it happens after we actually support what we thought was going to be a president in the Diem, but it actually turned out to be more of a dictator, Diem. And Diem is going to be the kind of ruler where he's very much going to set up a repressive government. His family and his family members are going to hold a lot of the high-ranking positions in the government and hold all of the power. Wealth is very much going to be hoarded by the elite, and the people, and especially the poorer people in South Vietnam, are going to suffer. And then ultimately the Buddhist majority, and by majority I mean like an estimated around 85 to 90% of the country was Buddhist. But Buddhists are going to be actually persecuted because Diem's going to be a Catholic, and we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second. In this government that gets supported by the United States, you basically have torture, lack of political freedoms and fixed elections, and really a lack of overall democracy that's going on. And this is something that's going to be aided and supported by the United States government. And President Eisenhower is going to send not only military personnel, and you can kind of see here in the last 2 years of his presidency, he does send 760 troops in 1959 and then 900 troops in 1960. But he's going to do this because of the fact that basically to him, he's supporting the lesser of two evils. And to him, he kind of sees it as he can support this dictator in terms of Diem, who he can kind of sort of a little bit kind of control, or he can let communism spread from North Vietnam to South Vietnam, and he stays committed to not allowing that to happen in any way, shape, or form. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is one of the more graphic and kind of shocking things that we're going to talk about in this part of the lecture, and it's the protest of the burning monk. And this has to do with your Buddhist monks who are angry about anti-Buddhist laws and pro-Catholic policies in South Vietnam, and especially a recent one that had banned the Buddhist flag in the country. And President Diem, when taking power, he had previously dedicated Vietnam to Jesus and the Catholic Church because he himself was a Catholic. And even days before his ban on the Buddhist flag, he had a very public ceremony that displayed the cross. And so it does kind of show that religious toleration isn't being held to in the country. The ban on the flag was eventually challenged by a Buddhist protest, which was done on the birthday of Buddha. And government forces ended up firing into the protesters and ultimately killed 9 people in that protest as kind of part of it. And it was that incident that led to the protest of the burning monk, which was done at a public intersection, and it was directly outside of the Cambodian embassy. And you basically had a large crowd of people that had gathered, and they were monks and nuns who had gathered to support the protest. And journalists were told that something big was going to occur, so that they did have some media coverage there. And while the photos do show the fact that the protester was aided in being doused with the flammable liquid, whatever it was, the match was ultimately struck by the protester himself, and he did so after a short prayer. Ultimately, after the death of the protester, many of the onlookers did pray and did show reverence by bowing down or kneeling in lots of ways. And then monks came out and they did cover the body with yellow robes, and they did take it to a nearby pagoda to kind of have a ceremony and show their remorse for the lost person. And while this was all happening, while the monks were kind of taking the body away, it was a very, very, very silent crowd for the most part, with the exception of one person on a microphone who constantly repeated in Vietnamese and English, "A Buddhist priest has burned himself to death. A Buddhist priest becomes a martyr." And this does kind of hold true to the fact of what this protest was supposed to be about. It was supposed to be show the fact that the Diem government was all about going after the Buddhists and not so much someone that was supporting in a lot of ways what we were hoping in being anti-communists. And the protester himself, the monk that did die, and ultimately, in this very shocking way, he did leave last words in a letter before his death, and he did write this. He said, "Before closing my eyes and moving towards the vision of the Buddha, I respectfully plead the President Diem to take a mind of compassion towards the people of the nation and implement religious equality to maintain the strength of the homeland eternally." And this does kind of very much show the fact that this is supposed to be something that was all about drawing attention to the fact that religious freedom and religious toleration should occur, especially when this is very much stifling the religious needs of the majority of the people of Vietnam. This is also a protest that does link back to the United States, and this is something that was mimicked in the United States by an anti-Vietnam War protester in 1965, and you did have a man in the United States, a Quaker man, who did light himself on fire right outside the Pentagon office of Secretary of State Robert McNamara, the same guy from the Fog of War, and from earlier in this lecture where I showed a picture with President Johnson. So as protests like the Burning Monk started to show that government discontent was started to grow, that kind of progresses us through the Kennedy years. And Kennedy, if you remember, was elected in 1960. And after taking over in 1960, in 1961, 1962, 1963, he really escalates troops every year. By the time he dies in 1963, we have 16,000 troops that are in Vietnam. And these troops are very much not so much military advisors like they were supposed to be. They're very much fighting like a very covert war against North Vietnam. And they're starting to do reconnaissance missions and other things that they probably shouldn't be doing at this time. In 1963, Kennedy also starts to see President Diem as more of a liability than any kind of an asset. And he does basically okay and greenlight a military coup, and he does support the Vietnamese military in overthrowing the government. He didn't think that it was going to lead to the murders of Diem and his brother, and you will kind of see in the clip that I'm going to show you that he was kind of shocked by that. But this is just 20 days before Kennedy himself was actually assassinated, which makes us a little bit ironic to hear him talk about an assassination attempt. In terms of like Kennedy he didn't write down his memoirs every day like a lot of presidents do. He instead actually went and he recorded them on an audio recording in the White House Oval Office every night. And this is him reflecting back on the Diem assassination. And so I'm going to play the clip and let you guys kind of watch it here. And here's the things that I want you guys to keep in mind while you watch the clip. First, how was the decision made to assassinate or so at least support the coup that was going to overthrow Diem? And how does Kennedy seem to feel about the Diem assassination itself? How does this clip give you a unique insight to Kennedy as both a person and like just an overall human as well as a leader? And then what are the concerns of Kennedy following the assassination of Diem? And so watch the clip. It's about 4 minutes long, but I'll start it right now.
Monday, November 4th, 1963. Over the weekend, the coup in Saigon took place. Culminated 3 months of conversation about a coup, conversation which divided the government here and in Saigon. Opposed to a coup was General Taylor, the Attorney General, Secretary McNamara, to a somewhat less degree, John McCone, partly because of an old hostility to Lodge, which causes him to lack confidence in Lodge's judgment, partly as a result of a new hostility, because Lodge shifted his station chief. Semicolon, in favor of the coup was State, led by Abel Harriman, George Ball, Roger Hillsman, supported by Mike Barstow at the White House. I feel that we must bear a good deal of responsibility for it, beginning with our cable of early August, in which we suggested the coup. Period, in my judgment, that wire was badly drafted. Comment should never have been sent on a Saturday. I should not have given my consent to it without a roundtable conference in which McNamara and Taylor could have presented their views. While we did redress that balance in later wires, that first wire encouraged Lodge along a course to which he was, in any case, inclined. Hawkins continued to oppose the coup on the ground that the military effort was doing well. There was a sharp split between Saigon and the rest of the country. Politically, the situation was deteriorating. Militarily, it had not had its effect. There was a feeling, however, that it would. For this reason, Secretary McNamara and General Taylor supported applying additional pressures to Diem and New in order to move them.
Hello. Naughty.
Why do the leaves fall? Why does the snow come on the ground?
Okay.
Why are the leaves turn green? And where do we go to Cape Transport? In summer.
And then
I was shocked by the death of Diem and New. I'd met Zim with Justice Douglas many years ago. He was an extraordinary character. While he became increasingly difficult in the last months, nevertheless, over a 10-year period, he held his country together, maintained its independence under very adverse conditions. The way he was killed made it particularly abhorrent. The question now is whether the generals can stay together and build a stable government, or whether Saigon will begin to turn on public opinion in Saigon, intellectuals, students, etc., will turn on this government as repressive and undemocratic in the not-too-distant future.
So following the assassination of President Kennedy, President Johnson takes over, and one of the things that he very much remembers is he remembers the fact that Harry Truman lost a lot of popularity and a lot of support when China became a communist nation because he got blamed for that loss. And he doesn't want to be the president that's very much going to see Southeast Asia have communism spread throughout it the way that Truman saw that happen. And one of the reasons that he's worried about this is because he doesn't only want to finish out Kennedy's presidency in 1963 and then the rest of 1964, but in November of 1964, you have an upcoming election, and he does want to run for president at that time. And what he's basically doing is he's reviving the idea of the domino theory. The idea that in Asia, if you have China and then Korea and then Vietnam that have all fallen to communism, that ultimately then it's going to spread to their neighbors in Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, etc. will also all become communist. And you're going to have this huge communist bloc that's going to exist in Asia that's going to be right below the already huge communist Soviet Union as part of this. In August of 1964, President Johnson actually got what he wanted, and he got an excuse to basically escalate tensions with Vietnam and ultimately get involved in a war to kind of prevent communism. And in hopes that we were eventually going to attack Vietnam, the United States had already been kind of running very covert intelligence missions in what was called the Gulf of Tonkin. And you can see the Gulf of Tonkin on the map, and it's on the northern part of Vietnam. So technically it does sit off northern Vietnamese waters. But the United States had said that we had claimed rights to the waters. They had basically clashed with communist patrol boats that were in the area, and you did have a firefight that did happen. Now, the Gulf of Tonkin incident involved a U.S. destroyer by the name of the USS Maddox, and you can see the USS Maddox pictured here. It's a pretty big destroyer, and it's not one of our huge battleships, but you can see at the front it does have 4 pretty big guns that would have taken care of the communist patrol boat no problem in terms of like an actual military fight. Now, that communist motorboat, that patrol boat, it does have a torpedo on board. With a direct shot, it could sink the Maddox, but it is a very, very kind of rare thing. Now, the Maddox does claim that it was fired upon. It does return fire, and then what you have is you have an escalation of tensions because 2 days later, the Maddox then claims that it was fired on again in the Gulf of Tonkin, and the Maddox does say that it returned fire in the second firefight as well. However, unlike the first firefight, there's no real proof that the Maddox was fired upon on a second day. And it's one of those kind of things that very much falsely escalate tensions, but it does give Johnson the opportunity to send what he already had planned, a pre-planned resolution to Congress. And Congress does give the president the right to take, quote unquote, all necessary measures to defend any nation in Southeast Asia that are threatened by communist aggression or subversion as part of this. And ultimately what Congress is doing is they're giving Johnson a blank check in a sense. And by that I mean they're giving him the right to send as many troops as he wants to Vietnam for an undisclosed amount of time. And that's really a lot of power to put in one president without actually having a formal declaration of Congress and actually having Congress have the ability to start to pull back troops if needed, and if this is a fight that gets too big. The political cartoon's pretty clever, and you can see it there off to the left. But you do have President Johnson that's sitting there. You can see that he's being presented the blank check in this sense by a U.S. military general, and he's basically saying the generals fill it out and send as many troops as you want to Vietnam, and this is approved by the U.S. Congress. And you can see that he says, will 200,000 be enough? But ultimately, no, it won't, because Johnson is going to send even more troops than that to Vietnam. But if you look at this quick little graph before we flip on to the next slide and kind of progress to the end of the lecture, you can see that right after the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, that you do have a massive increase of troops, and it is almost 200,000 by 1965. It will ultimately get up to over 500,000. So we've hit the end of the lecture, and now that we have, go back and answer the concept questions that I told you to think about at the beginning of this, and you should be able to answer how and why the United States involvement in Vietnam escalated, and as well, in what larger context did President Johnson view the Vietnam conflict, and why was he so determined to support South Vietnam in this fight? That's the end, and thank you for listening.